Chapter 1. Welcome to Ellis Island, the ranger from the National Park Service said to the group of fifth graders standing before her. This museum is dedicated to the millions of immigrants who passed through these buildings on their way to becoming American citizens. There was one fifth grader, however, who was not thinking about the buildings or the millions of immigrants who passed through them. This fifth grader was thinking about his feet. If only they would stop growing, Dominic Cantori thought. He stared down at his toes, which were painfully squeezed into a pair of old sneakers. Then he looked around him at all the sneakers on his classmates' feet. Some looked as if they had never been worn before. Dominic sighed. He longed to have a new, fashionable pair of sneakers, a pair that fit. But he knew it wasn't going to happen any time soon. Having new, fashionable sneakers and keeping up with Dominic's quickly growing feet was almost impossible as long as he lived with one foster family after another. He had grown so much in the past few weeks that he was unable to tie his laces, and he finally just pulled them out. Whenever he could, when no one was watching, he would slip his feet out of the tight sneakers so that his cramped toes could unbend. He checked now to see that no one was looking, and as the ranger talked on, Dominic silently worked his left heel out of his sneaker. As we search our family trees, many of us can find relatives who came through Ellis Island as immigrants, the ranger continued. Dominic stood for a moment, wiggling his free toes within his sock, wondering about his family tree. What would it look like? He imagined a little twig with only one tiny leaf hanging from it. On the leaf was his name. That was it. Dominic had never known his family. His parents had both died when he was a baby. He had no brothers or sisters. There were no grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, or uncles. The state had tried to locate any living relatives, but none could be found. Dominic had become a ward of the state, and no one had come to claim him. Now he was living with his third foster family this year in Brooklyn, New York. Besides a few possessions that fit into 3 suitcases, the most important thing that Dominic owned was a gold key that hung from a chain around his neck. You could see that the key was very old. It had been with his mother's belongings when she died. It's not real gold, a kid in one of his classes had pointed out, but that didn't matter to Dominic. What mattered were the initials, S.C., scratched on the key. Dominic loved to rub his fingers over them. Sal Cantori had been his father's name, and he was certain the key must have belonged to him. The key's history, like Dominic's, was a mystery. He had no idea what it was meant to open, but it was the only thing left from his family, something he could touch, something solid. It was his lucky key, and he wore it always on a chain around his neck. But Dominic wasn't sure just how much his lucky key was working. In fact, he had been a kid with an incredibly bad luck. Dave Santos, his caseworker, had called him just yesterday. Dominic's current foster family regretted to inform him that things weren't going to work out after all. They were moving to California at the end of the month, and they wouldn't be able to take him along. Dave had already begun to look for another family. Dominic had not been surprised. He had grown accustomed to things not working out. Even so, the old fear of being abandoned and of having to move in with strangers left his stomach in knots. Once again, Dominic was haunted with the familiar questions. What would these new people be like? Where would he sleep? Who would he turn to if something went wrong? And how long would he stay there before he was told to pack his things and move on? Dominic had been with so many families that he had developed a game to help him still the fear of having to fit into yet another new place with strange people, strange noises, and strange smells. He would lie in his bed at night, whichever bed, in whichever apartment, and as he lay there, he would twist his golden key on its chain and imagine a perfect family, his dream family. In this family, there was always a mother and a father that he would call Mom and Dad. There would be a refrigerator and cupboards that were always filled with pizza and marshmallows and potato chips that he could have any time he wanted. There would be warm, homemade brownies on the kitchen table when he came home from school, And best of all, in his dream family, there would be brothers to play with and lots of pets to care for. Sometimes he imagined a sheepdog, and other times he imagined a parrot or a monkey. In real life, Dominic was not allowed to have any pets because, as his caseworker explained, he never knew if the families he stayed with would allow one. Unlike in real life, things were perfect in his dream family, and it was this dream family that saw him through many scary moves and many long and lonely nights spent under bedspreads that smelled of other people's houses. Dominic had been in many different schools, in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. He had only been at his present school for 3 days when his new teacher, Mr. Howard, had told him that all the 5th grade classes would be going on a trip to Ellis Island the following Monday. That had been perfect timing. Dominic loved class trips. He always hoped that each new trip was going to be his best ever. The soft cadence of the ranger's voice drifted back to him. Many of you may discover your family history right here at the Ellis Island Museum. But Dominic knew that he wouldn't be one of the many. "This is boring. I wish we could get back on the boat," he heard somebody whisper. Dominic looked in front of him, where a red-headed boy, wearing fancy new sneakers, whispered to another boy with bristly blonde hair. Dominic knew they were best friends, and he also knew the red-haired boy's name was Justin. He watched as Justin leaned over and burped in his friend's ear. Dominic felt envious as he watched them. He wished that he had a friend who would lean over and burp in his ear. As Dominic imagined himself with such a friend, he giggled out loud. A boy next to him whispered, "What's so funny?" Immediately, Dominic's smile vanished and he lowered his eyes to the floor to avoid the boy's gaze. The boy shrugged his shoulders and looked away. Dominic bit down on his lower lip. How he wished he could share his funny thoughts and laugh with someone, but he just didn't know how. Talking to new kids was always hard for him, and new kids were the only kids he ever seemed to meet. Dominic hadn't spoken to anyone except the teacher since he arrived. It was the same in every school. He always hoped that he would make a friend, but he never had. He was painfully shy, and he was never one to begin a friendship. And by the time the kids in his class got to know him, Dominic was yanked out of that school and sent off to another. Justin turned around suddenly and looked at Dominic. Then he continued his hushed conversation with his friend. Dominic heard their muffled laughter. He wondered if the kids were laughing at him. He was used to people making fun of the new kid. Dave always told him kids did that because they were uncomfortable themselves. "I know it's hard," Dave often said, "but you've got to let yourself get past the new kid thing. Just be yourself and trust that people will like you." It always sounded so easy when Dave said that, but learning to trust that people would like him was just one of those things that Dominic didn't think he'd ever be able to do. Everyone's attention was on the ranger now as she pointed to a display. Dominic leaned forward and worked his other heel out and wiggled his toes in his sock. It was here at Ellis Island that the newly arrived immigrants were questioned and medically inspected to make sure they could support themselves, the ranger said. A boy standing beside Dominic leaned over to look at a display and accidentally stepped hard on Dominic's foot. Dominic yelped in pain and surprise. A number of kids turned to look at him and laughed. "He sounded like a howling dog," someone said. The ranger continued to speak over the commotion. Ellis Island has been called the Island of Hope because so many people had hoped to make a new start in America. But it was also called the Island of Tears. Does anyone know why? Tears welled up in Dominic's eyes as a big hand suddenly rested on his shoulder. Maybe this wasn't going to be the best class trip after all, he thought to himself. As he fingered his lucky key, Dominic turned around and looked up to see his teacher's eyes staring sternly into his.